Austin here. Welcome to Raytown Chop Shop.
And Mike here. Besides our own projects, sometimes we build vehicles for our friends. For instance, I agreed to restore this 1939 Chrysler Royal Windsor for my friend Philip. I've known Philip since 1963, and after years of bugging me and the Chrysler sitting for 30 years, I took the Chrysler for its first drive. 5 years later, I gave it back to Philip, completely restored and ready to enjoy.
And now, let's enjoy part 5 of the KawaBunga build.
Once we had the seat installed and Austin tried it out, we noticed a lot of flex in the frame. To take away that flex and strengthen the entire frame, we cut, positioned, clamped, and welded in short tubes every 12 inches between the top and bottom rails of the go-kart.
I used my CAD skills again to make a template for the steel plate that would hold the original Kawasaki handlebars. By making a plate, we had something we could attach the steering column to. I transferred the template onto some flat bar and used the plasma cutter to cut it out.
Again, the plasma cutter left a lot of slag on the plate. Time for the grinder.
I cleaned up inside the cuts with a die grinder.
Here's what the plate looked like after we cleaned it up.
I had to make 3 plugs that were going to weld to the plate. Here, I'm drilling the mounting hole for the center plug.
With the center plug turned and drilled, we did a quick test fit.
I used the lathe again to turn the 2 outside plugs for the steering plate. I installed the outside plugs into the handlebars. This is where the front forks used to be on the motorcycle.
With all 3 plugs in place, Austin tacked them with a TIG welder. Here's what the plate looks like before the plugs are final welded.
All 3 plugs are welded solid and the plate is ready to be attached to the handlebars. It took a little bit of fine tuning to get the plate to slide into place. All the heat from the final weld distorted the dimensions. It took some hammering, heating, and grinding, but we finally got the steering plates to slide into the holes in the handlebars.
And here's the final product. The handlebars are going to be about 3 feet farther forward than they were on the motorcycle. So Austin and Chris removed all the controls so we could use the handlebars to fabricate the steering column for the go-kart. We'll have to extend the electrical wiring, control cables, and brake line once the handlebars are in their new position and we're ready to take the KawaBunga for a test drive.
Time to start on the steering system. Since I widened the front axle, we had to make new tie rods. We cut a solid bar to length. We're going to use the original heim joints on the tie rods, so I had to turn the ends of the steel bar down to size.
Once the ends were cut, Austin chamfered the ends of the tie rods so we could cut new threads for the heim joints. Here's a little trick to help you start cutting new threads on a solid shaft. With the tie rod still in the lathe, use the drill chuck to keep pressure on the die when you make your initial cuts. It keeps the die square to the shaft and helps prevent cutting the threads at the wrong angle. Once the first couple of threads are cut, it's just a matter of taking your time, backing off the die occasionally to clear out the cut metal, and cutting the new threads. We did a quick test fit while the tie rod was still in the lathe in case we needed to fix the threads. The original heim joint goes right on.
Chris and Dad got the new tie rod ready to install by threading on the lock nut and the heim joints. The first tie rod goes on.
With the heim joints threaded on all the way, the new tie rod is almost to center, which means we have enough room for adjustment to get the front end aligned. We connected both tie rods together and simulated the steering action. So far, so good. In order to find out where the final placement of the handlebars was going to be, we clamped a couple of 2x4s to the frame, put another board on top of them, and held the handlebars in place. We needed to check for comfort, clearance, and ease of steering. We used a couple of ratchet extensions and a swivel socket to make sure the angle from the handlebars to the main steering shaft wasn't going to be too tight. Looks like it's going to work.
Chris and I bent the 1-inch tubing that we're going to use as the support bar for the steering system. We notched the ends of the tubes and did a trial fit on the frame. Looks like we have enough clearance for the driver's legs. I tack welded the support in place.
The boys did a pretty good job with the steering support bar.
Next, we had to come up with a way to attach the steering column, but also be able to remove it if we had to make any repairs or adjustments. I cut a series of short tubes and tacked them to the bottom of the steering plate. All 3 tubes are welded in place.
I was still a little confused about how all this was going to work, so the boys showed me how the 3 tubes came into play. Well, now it all makes sense.
We cut an old 1/2-inch ratchet extension in half to use as the mounting point for the swivel. I cut a piece of larger tube that would act as a stop and slid it over the smaller tube and welded it in place. I placed the female end of the 1/2-inch extension on the steering tube and welded it.
The boys gave me the job of fabricating the upper steering column mounting bracket. I used a piece of angle iron. I cut the notch for the larger tube the steering column would slide into and rounded off the corners of the bracket for safety. I cleaned up the corners and the notch on the grinding wheel. The upper steering column bracket is tacked in place.
Once we were happy with the bracket placement, we popped it off the support bar and I final welded the tube to the bracket.
Austin final welded the upper steering bracket to the steering column support.
We inserted the steering plate and upper shaft into the support bracket. You can see the 1/2-inch swivel already attached to the extension end I welded on earlier.
Time to work on the main steering shaft. Austin welded a large washer to one end of the steering shaft.
I welded the other half of the extension we cut earlier inside the washer. The male end of the extension is good and solid.
With the upper steering shaft and main steering shaft attached to the swivel, it's time to look to see if it's all going to work. Looks like everything is going to work the way we wanted it to, in principle.
We cut off the original column's center pivots. We're going to use this to connect the 2 tie rods. I welded the original center pivots to the new steering column.
Here are 3 quick shots that give you a better idea of how the whole steering system looks.
We noticed there was a lot of play in the steering column. The 2 tubes aren't an exact fit, so we had to come up with a way to take up the slop. We found some old roof flashing lying around the shop. I cut it to length and made some flanges on the end. I slid the bushing into the upper mounting bracket tube. I pushed the steering column in place. I folded down the flanges to keep the bushings from falling through.
The bushing took up a lot of play, but then we found the 1/2-inch swivel was also sloppy.
After pressing the pins out of the swivel, I took some measurements and began turning new pins out of a couple bolts that would be a more precise fit in the swivel.
With the new pins installed, a lot of the play was gone.
Time to fabricate the lower steering column bracket and weld it in place. I cut another set of bushings for the lower steering bracket and slid them in. I pushed the steering column through the lower bracket and bushings. And connected it to the swivel. Now all we have to do is finish installing the tie rods.
And that wraps up part 5 of the KawaBunga build.
Just like we're about to wrap up the build of this 1978 Honda CB750 for our friend Maggie. We started with a pretty sad bike that had been impounded by the police, completely stripped it down, and then started restoring every little thing. We only have a few more pieces to bolt on, and it'll be ready for Maggie to take out on the open road. Thanks for watching.